The CoinWeek Podcast is brought to you by PCGS, the official grading service of the International Money Expo. Come to Music City, Nashville, Tennessee from October 26 to 28 to witness the debut of this important new numismatic convention. To learn more about the show, go to www.imx.show or www.pcgs.com. In this episode of the CoinWeek Podcast, I sit down with author and leading dealer in historical documents, Kenneth Rendell. Kenneth has recently written a new book called Safeguarding History, which is published by Whitman. It's an autobiography that touches on a bunch of major themes, which are of great interest to me and to other collectors. Kenneth, of course, got international notoriety for debunking the Hitler diary hoax, which was perpetrated by a German tabloid publisher in the 1980s. Since then, he's gone on to debunk other popular memorabilia hoaxes, including Mormon forgeries, forgeries of the Elvis and Jack the Ripper diaries, and more. In this episode, we talk about his life in and out of the collecting market. It's a must-listen-to interview, and that's next on the CoinWeek Podcast. Hi, everybody. This is Charles Morgan, and joining me today on the CoinWeek Podcast is Kenneth Rendell. Kenneth is a leading dealer in historical documents and letters with expertise that spans the world from antiquity to the present. His galleries in New York, Beverly Hills, and Tokyo serve a sophisticated clientele of institutional and private collectors. He has famously debunked fraudulent diaries and documents related to topics touching on pop culture, historical events, and religion. His work on these issues were a cause for the Department of Justice to bestow upon him special recognition for his assistance in recovering documents stolen from America's National Archives. And I'm not talking about the banker's boxes, which were recently recovered in a Florida country club. Today, Ken joins me to discuss his new book, Safeguarding History, Trailblazing Adventures Inside the Worlds of Collecting and Forging History, which was recently published by Whitman. So, Ken, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on to discuss your quite remarkable autobiography.
Thank you.
So, early on in your book, you touch upon a thing which I think is like vital for collectors, especially sophisticated collectors, to understand. And you talk about the con. Early in your book, when you're discussing this, you tell a story about how your family moved to this I think it's Somerville, Massachusetts, right?
Alston, Massachusetts.
So you talk about how your family moves to Alston, Massachusetts, a place where you describe as having a pervasive criminal underbelly, where seemingly everybody has been corrupted by it, from the cop on the beat to the merchants to the people themselves. And you say that your parents, coming from where they came from, didn't have any experience with this. They came from a normal culture, and so they were very susceptible to falling victim to the con. And you talk about how this also relates to collectors sometimes, where they come from a normal sort of part of culture and they get really enthusiastic about collecting, and they're just not aware of the existence of con men. Do you think as a youngster growing up in that environment, you were more prepared to deal with it than your parents, or were you completely caught off guard by it as well?
I think I was just as caught off guard as they were. It just wasn't in our culture, in my family's culture or normal culture, to expect people were going to deceive you, rob you, and that it was a way of life. I tell, and it's quite serious, that the kids I played ball with, they all aspired to not get caught as often as their old man did. And everybody's father was in prison or about to go to prison or had just been released from prison. It was just a way of thinking. And the art world and the collecting world doesn't think in those terms. You expect that people who are interested in the same collecting subjects as you are similar to yourself. I mean, you don't think of conning someone or creating a forgery. So you're not prepared for that to happen. So you're not skeptical. Also, collecting is fun and satisfying. And you might be a tough guy in business, but you want to relax with your collection. You want it to be different. You want to be able to behave and think differently. So you might not be susceptible in business to being conned, but in collecting, some people have a suspension of disbelief.
It's as if their hope or their aspiration for getting that object or that important piece overrides their sort of their ability to analyze the situation. And I think we make a lot of assumptions. I think collectors typically make assumptions based on what how they want to interpret what they see,
what they want to believe. I mean, I used to be confronted with people who wrote to movie stars to get signed photographs. And people thought that these movie stars actually spent all this time signing these things. And they went through the studio. They didn't have any direct contact. And of course, there's somebody else signing them, or a machine was signing them. But the movie star couldn't possibly sign all of this material. But they really believed it.
And I'm sure that's sort of the bane of the autograph dealer, is dealing with the industry of creating these collectibles.
Well, and modern presidential letters that aren't signed, they're signed by auto pen. Jimmy Carter said that he was never going to use the auto pen because he wanted things going out that were genuinely signed, and he was told he had to sign 250,000 pieces a year. And that was the end of that. And he used the auto pen like everybody else.
So I wanted to talk about how you get involved in being a dealer or a coin dealer. I suppose, your dad having a pharmacy and having a cash register there at that period in time provided the opportunity. Why was it that youngsters at this period, when you look at least the coin business, there are youngsters all over the country figuring out that they can make money selling coins that are coming to them through either their part-time jobs as paper delivery boys or their connection to somebody who does have a register till to pull this material from. What is it about youngsters figuring that out that all the adults around them were oblivious to?
Well, I think that the possibilities of making money were on such a low rate that it appealed to kids, but adults would see it as a lot of work without that much payoff. But you could do it. I've gotten letters from a lot of people that I know who never knew that I started with coins, and the possibilities of going through the change from gumball machines, and you find pennies you can sell for 10 cents. Doesn't appeal to adults, but it's 9 cents profit on a penny. And for kids, it was opportunity. There also were, I believe, laws against working when you were under 16 years old. So you couldn't get a job if you wanted to do something. And coins were easily accessible. You could go to the bank and get rolls of pennies, which was what everybody did, was the most popular thing.
What I'm struck by at least your early period here when you begin working is, how you describe this idea of selling a penny for 10 cents that has a face value of $1. And of course your parents are going through tremendous financial hardships trying to keep their pharmacy going, not necessarily a profitable business. Were you able to contribute to their financial picture, or were you using this opportunity on a small scale to try to build up your own financial ability to be independent?
I think it went both ways. I think that I didn't have to ask them for anything in my recreational interest, which was skating. Well, I got in for free as part of this whole corrupt neighborhood. And even if you went to where you would buy a ticket and pretend to buy a ticket, the ticket taker had just gotten out of prison for armed robbery. And so all the local kids, he just waved them through as if he had looked at their tickets. But skates cost money, and travel to races cost money, and I was able to pay for everything myself. So I wasn't a drain in any way on them. But the most valuable thing, which started everything, my 1806 half dollar, when I sold that for $3.50, I offered to give it to my mother because she had given me the coin. And she said no, it was my money, my initiative. She just thought of it as a curiosity. I turned it into $3.50 and bought it back.
And bought it back. That's right. So sadly, you lose your father right around the time you turn 18 years old. You write about the weight of the financial problems and how it ultimately broke him. It drove him to alcohol, drug abuse, and that early death. With the passing of all these years, I mean, have you found it easier to understand the situation he was in and view him differently than you might have as a 18-year-old?
Absolutely. Writing the memoir, and one of the key things I did in writing this memoir was I went back to find myself at these different ages and see that person, not from today's perspective, but to understand that person at the time. And much to my surprise, writing about all of this and revisiting myself at 18, 17 years old, I felt at peace with everything that had gone on. And that was very difficult to do at the time. I mean, there was just so much turmoil and problems and failure. And I mean, he was legally bankrupt. He couldn't turn people down. There wasn't any welfare in those days. And when people needed prescriptions, he gave them the medicine, but he couldn't afford to do it. And he was in a tough spot. He had a lot of empathy with people. He really liked people. But it was hopeless. I mean, you were going to run out of money, and the drugstore went bankrupt. But dealing with it now has given me a sense of peace with all of what went on. And as I looked at how I've been and why I've been successful, I realized the basis that my parents gave me, apart from the turmoil before the chaos of the drugstore, and how important that was. And that's a good feeling. I'm considering, I considered them in a different light.
And of course, you probably at the time struggled also from the fact that you were shifting your interest from coins, which you had early success in, to historical papers and documents, which was sort of a uncharted territory for you. You felt, in your book, you say that you felt guilty that you were not able to contribute money at the same level because you were venturing into this new area, which wasn't as profitable. Did that make you feel really guilty at the time?
Yes. I mean, the timing of everything was terrible, and not that there could be a good time, but I think it I thought if I had another year, I could have straightened things out. And but I didn't have another year. I mean, if I was further along and I was strained financially trying something new, um, and I had to build it up, and I needed the cash I had for inventory. So yeah, it took quite a toll on me. Fortunately, as I started to turn things around financially, I met a great psychiatrist who helped me immeasurably. And in a really odd twist that just seemed to happen in my life, the psychiatrist wanted to be an antique dealer. And we ended up opening an antique shop in Harvard Square, Cambridge. He was a terrible businessman, but he really enjoyed it. And it was kind of the payoff. I would go and see him and would talk about my problems for half an hour and then talk about his wishes and his dreams for half an hour, and no money was exchanged. But it pulled me through.
So how about your mother? I mean, was she, you say that she was working double shifts just to make ends meet. Was she able to at least reap some of the benefit of your success?
Yeah. Fortunately, she lived long enough to see a lot of my success and to meet my wife and have grandchildren, and that was very satisfying. She died in my house. I had moved her into my house when she was I was told she had about 2 weeks left to live, and it was pretty miserable being in the hospital. And she lasted for 8 months. I made her martinis the way she liked them every night, and we watched old movies. It was the way to go. Having lost one parent in such a tragic way, it was very satisfying to have all that time with my mother.
Well, I'm glad you guys had the chance to do that. So when you're coming up as a dealer, you befriend some other dealers in your age group. You talk about meeting Dave Bowers, I guess, when you're a teenager, and Dave's been a lifelong friend of yours, I understand. How important was it for you to find other like-minded individuals in your own age cohort? And do you find that you maintained, or those relationships were things that you maintained throughout your career?
It was very important because I didn't have the money to deal in federal coins, and I didn't have any particular edge. Since capital was a big issue. Dealing in federal coinage, there wasn't anything I could really add to the process. But with colonial coins, which really interested me, and which most dealers had no knowledge about, that was an area where I could add knowledge, and I didn't need a lot of capital. And then to meet people like Dave, well, there is only one, not people like Dave Bowers. Dave was really unique in that he had a foot in each world. He appreciated colonials, he appreciated hard times tokens, Civil War tokens, medals, but he made money in federal coinage, dealing with the normal things that everybody had at a show. So Dave was really different. I mean, the other people in the original Rittenhouse group, Criswell with Confederate currency, and Dick Johnson with medals, George Fuld doing Civil War tokens. Dave was the only one who had a foot in both worlds. And we instantly became friends. I mean, it was chemistry. We did various trips together. The first one, I couldn't do any driving because I didn't have a driver's license. I think I was 14 years old. We went through we went to an ANA convention in LA, and then drove to Mexico, and then up through the national parks in California. It was a really good trip. And it was really enjoyable with the other people that I mentioned, sharing. Coins are very good in that there are conventions and coin shows. So you do see people face to face. It's not the lonely world that some other collecting is. So people were very important.
So, I'm going to guess that it's probably a little bit intimidating to be a young dealer in an environment where, capital essentially drives the ability to purchase the higher end material, and most of that capital is in the hands of older, more established dealers. I mean, did you find the numismatic marketplace was more welcoming than the historical document market?
Well, it was because there was a segment interested in actual numismatics, as opposed to just rare dates, and that there was a whole segment that was well established. Communication was through coin shows or numismatic news in the scrapbook and then Coin World. Whereas the historical letters and document business was isolated, which gave me the great advantage of going to see people. They had never met a dealer. The collectors had never met a dealer unless they went to a big city. Everything was done in the mail or with catalogs. So coins were much more accessible. I mean, I never thought of the high-end coins. I remember some guy who I used to see at coin shows. He did an exhibit at one of them of $50 gold pieces. Well, I mean, this was just beyond comprehension, with every one of them cost thousands of dollars. And to do a whole collection, that was just a different world. Amon Carter was a collector, currency mainly. And he used to show off with buying something and trying to pay with a $10,000 bill. And of course, nobody had the cash, but Dave Bowers got him, because Dave Bowers got several $10,000 bills. And when Amon Carter came to Dave's table and bought something minor and tried to pay with a $10,000 bill, Dave reached in his pocket and said, he said, I haven't got anything smaller. And that was a real one-upsmanship. But, I'm talking about the camaraderie being important. And it was, in collecting fields, the reinforcement of other people being interested. It's not so much reassurance, but it's a shared interest. And I really felt that with coins. There were a lot of very positive things besides the coins.
Well, I'd imagine part of the allure of paying 5,000 times face value for a copper cent is the idea that somebody else would pay that for it. I mean, I think that's in some respects what drives collectors to be confident to pay the sums they pay for this material.
Well, and that you're not crazy. And I wrote in my book about the huge change in the coin business about 1960, where you started having coin shops in local towns. I mean, when I remember people treating me like I was nuts, dealing with coins. People really do that, or people actually make a living at it. To it becoming acceptable, you saw coin stores, and coins really went mainstream starting about 1960. So I think that's also, it's the shared experience that you and other people appreciate these things. And I think that the financial aspect must be there too.
Well, I wanted to talk about another experience that you write about. This one I found to be really compelling. You discussed an episode early in your career as a document dealer that where you're being bullied by another dealer after you had made a purchase. And this dealer insisted that you sell him this material that you purchased because you bought it from his source, and if you didn't, he'd run you out of the business. What did it take for you to stand up to him and say no to that? And did he actually try to follow through on these threats?
I don't know that he was relevant enough. He thought he was. He had worked for this very important dealer, and in a way inherited his business. And I think he had an inflated idea of how important he was. And everybody else thought he was a has-been. And so a lot of people thought he never was, that he just worked around the edge of this important dealer. As I sit here, I am looking at the two chairs we sat in. So in the end, I ended up with the chairs. When he died, I bought them. I think my standing up to a lot of people in court cases everywhere, I can only attribute it to the traumas that I faced when I was young, the tough things that I went through. Because in all these forgery cases and appraisal cases, people do try to bully you. They try to push you around, and I have never been pushed around. No one could ever get me to change my mind except factually with information. And I stood alone in so many cases, like the Hitler Diaries. I was hired to determine what they were, not to prove they were forgeries. I would have been really pleased if they were genuine. But I was the only person who said they were forged. And there was all these people in Europe who had authenticated them, but they all did a really poor job. I never got pushed around by the media. They certainly tried. One network news, they were paying me, I think, $300 a day as a consultant. And they wanted me to kind of make something up that could be on network news that day. And they said, well, we're not going to pay you a retainer anymore unless you can dream things up to say. And I said, well, then you don't pay me. But when I have this story and it's nailed down, I want all the back money, which I got to be interviewed. I got paid for all the days that I wasn't on air. I just had I think when you deal with a lot of real life threatening things, you have things in context. But I never could I couldn't say that I stood up to people for a specific reason. Other than that, if I didn't buckle under to all the pressures and tragedies when I was really young, I wasn't going to buckle under at a later point.
Well, I'll talk about my experience learning about the Hitler Diary story, but I have to ask, I mean, did you buy the chairs as sort of to remind you of that moment, or did you just like the chairs?
Well, I liked who originally owned them.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have his table, and I have other chairs. So I bought quite a few things that were part of this major rare book dealer who built the big libraries in the first half of the century, and I was doing it in the second half of the 1900s. I think I would have bought them anyhow as a reminder of what happened when I was a kid. And the rest of that story was I went outside this guy's office on 57th Street, and I called the man who sold this material to me. And he had a lot more material, and he was irate that this dealer thought that he owned him as a source. And I ended up getting the whole collection on consignment. It was a big breakthrough for me.
So So on the Hitler Diary thing, I'm a Gen Xer, so this would have happened when I was in elementary school. But I distinctly remember this being covered on the national news, and it was covered in Newsweek, which we had a subscription to. But as you detail it in the book, the story basically is not only a hoax about the diaries themselves, but it's also a con on the part of the publisher, and also a con on the part of one of their journalists who was skimming money off of the story itself, and then it was also some international publications willing to go along with it to sell papers and magazines. But one of the things at the core of it, which I think is kind of astonishing to think about, there's also the con on the part of the desire of certain Germans to rehabilitate the image of Hitler, so that they essentially could maybe take off the yoke of their own responsibility for going along with the Nazi regime. I mean, many of these folks were still alive, still in power at this time in Germany, and as they were getting older, I guess they wanted to, sort of reframe their own lives. So this was a fraud and a con on so many different levels. It must have been head spinning to parse this out.
That's true. I think that the issue I brought up, which was the desire of Germans to believe that their parents who voted for Hitler had been conned and had been misled, and that Hitler really was okay, and that's what the diaries made him out to be. I think that desire was just subconscious. I don't think people. I was told by Stern magazine that there was a real neo-Nazi element who really wanted the diaries to be genuine, and that they were concerned about my safety in going to Germany, and that I proved that they were fake. They didn't want that. I mean, there definitely was a much nicer Hitler in the diaries than in reality. But it was amazing how people were deceiving each other, just not in the general public. I'm not speaking of the general public, but in the whole publication world. That the reporter is lying about everything in his dealings with the forger. The reporter is getting most of the money. He's getting it from the owner of Stern. He's gone around the editor who told him he didn't want to hear any more Nazi crap. And the poor editor at the end had to resign. But he was really against this. But once the owner had done this, and supposedly things had been authenticated, it was his job to publish it, and he did, and he believed everything. He didn't want it because he just hated the whole Nazi culture. But on and on, everybody was screwing everybody. Everybody was conning everybody.
You feel like there's some analog, I guess, to how we're going to end up viewing ourselves. I mean, I don't think Americans are going to be immune from that same sense of trying to rehabilitate the things that we've done wrong. I mean, historical documents are important objects, but it seems like oftentimes the content of those documents run counter to the narratives that we want to believe about ourselves. I mean, you can take, documents pertaining to the Southern secession and versus the way we want to believe, what the causes we want to believe cause that conflict. And you look at other things, I'm sure, throughout political history where the actual primary sources are different than the historical narratives. So do you feel like we're also susceptible to these cons?
I think I think there are a lot of them going on now. There are a lot of people who are angry, who are adopting conspiracy theories. and political beliefs that on both ends of the spectrum that are not solidly based at all. Not the need. The problem is not being eradicated by people at both ends of the spectrum. It's driving more people to the other end of the spectrum. We can't really know what's real in the news because it's so easy to fake it and alter it. And the news cycle is so fast, 24 hours a day, that you have to wonder just how much time does a news source have to check anything? And are they in that business anymore? Or is all news entertaining? And it has an entertainment value, and it moves on very quickly. One of the things working with news magazines, which don't exist anymore, was that there was time. Both Time and Newsweek started printing on Saturday night. And one of the things that made it easy working with Newsweek was I knew they wouldn't use something. If I told them something on Monday, they couldn't gain anything from it for a week. It wasn't going to be on the news the next morning. And there was time to investigate. There was time to consider. And I think that's all really different now.
Well, I have to imagine that if the Stern had the Hitler Diary hoax drama unfold today, that you might not even have the opportunity to debunk it, so that's the accepted interpretation of what had happened. I think the conspiracies would rage on forever. It may be impossible to debunk these things now.
It may be. I actually have never used social media, so I'm not aware of what goes on there. But I mean, just looking at the statements about what's happened in Israel, and I saw the European Union saying that Twitter was publishing fake news. It's part of the game, I guess, these days.
And what amounts to, I guess, a postscript in the book about the Hitler hoax story. You talk about another hoax diary, although this one was actually written by the actual historical figure. You talk about the Benito Mussolini diary that he sort of tried to concoct near the end of his life to, again, excuse himself for his culpability. What is it in this case, I guess, although you could vouch for the possibility that Mussolini actually wrote it with his own hand, the fact that the content or the subject matter of it was clearly meant to deceive the reader, how much does something like that impact the value or the importance of a collectible or a historical document? And do you find that the subject matter of this material is very important in determining, how much, how important it is to either preserve or to collect?
Well, absolutely. The content is everything. My conclusion with Mussolini was that he did write it. He faked it. It's all about, he loves the Catholic Church. He loves his wife. His mistress is never mentioned. As far as what he did in Italy, now he's a prisoner at this point of the Italians. They've overthrown him. And he's writing this as he wants to be remembered. Everything bad that happened, Hitler made him do it. He would never have done these things because he loves the Italian people. It was the son of the person who killed Mussolini who had the diary. And I told him that the biggest problem was that it didn't really have much publication value because it wasn't true. I mean, it was amusing and interesting, but that the content could be argued. The content and the right to publish it anyhow belonged to Mussolini's daughter, who was still alive. So that took out any publishing value. So it had an artifact value. And I don't think it would sell for all that much money. Mussolini documents, I mean, they don't sell for very much. There's just very little interest. And Italy, Mussolini was in the war, but you could argue that the Italians weren't. I mean, there was a joke in the artifact collecting world about World War II guns. Somebody describing an Italian World War II rifle, never fired but dropped once. And, I think that's heroic, actually, that the Italians had no reason to fight, and they didn't. So this is not going to sell in Italy. So I just didn't think it had a lot of value. I mean, maybe $10,000, but it's a pretty low price relative to everything else.
You talk about another type of correspondence. There was a letter, I guess you were offered from Patty Reagan, the daughter, I guess the eldest daughter of President Ronald Reagan, and she had a very famously fractured relationship with her father and her mother, specifically Nancy Reagan, and her didn't really get along at all. And in the letter, which was, I guess it was written around Christmas, Ronald Reagan was writing to his daughter and trying to understand like what had happened to cause such a bad relationship between the two, and whether it was something he had done or something that some way she was looking at it. And you were offered this letter, but after, I guess, accepting it, you told her that you weren't going to buy any more letters like this from her. Is personal content like that in these letters, which are certainly very interesting, but they do raise the question of the ethics or morality of collecting. Do you feel like collectors of historical pieces typically try to separate the figures, the subject matter, and the content of the letters in order to preserve the historical place and time? Or do you feel that there's some topics which are just so distasteful that collectors just probably don't want to be part of that?
I think generally people don't want to be part of it. If you had a letter by an important person saying, I'm going to kill myself for the following reasons, that would be very hard to sell that letter. People like enlightening letters. They can be serious, deal with issues, but not ones that are very depressing. I have never sold letters that I thought could be published and embarrass someone. And that was the point with Reagan. I had bought 3 or 4 letters written to Patty. And I thought that the Christmas letter, she could have set that situation up to get her father to write such a letter to her. And the letter was highly personal. I think any parent could sympathize with Ronald Reagan in that situation. I made sure the letter would not be published. It would not be on the market. I sold it to a supporter of Ronald Reagan who had bought the other letters as well, and didn't want them, thought they were personal. They were too personal. It was father to a daughter. And I had it as far as I bought the Christmas letter and told her that was it. I wasn't going to buy anything else. That I thought she was creating the situations to have the letters written. And I'm not sure it made it in the book, but I sat behind Reagan at a Malcolm Forbes event. And I said to my wife, I really wish I had the nerve to lean forward and say, Mr. President, next time you want to write to your daughter, fax it to her, because she's selling me the originals. But I didn't do it. I mean, I thought he's got enough problems dealing with Patty. He doesn't need to know that she's selling the letters.
So
I'm not in the business of sensationalizing and embarrassing people who now you can say I'm making the determination, but good people, people with everybody within families can have disagreements, and teenage kids are hard to deal with, and that's all pretty normal stuff. Yeah, I'm in this field for upbeat experiences, not negative.
You mentioned that another set of papers and tapes that you were able to review were the Nixon papers and the Nixon tapes, which I'm sure are of great historical interest, enough that there's a law now, the Presidential Records Act, in order to safeguard this material. But did you find in reviewing any of that the material where you would have thought would have been too embarrassing to sell on the market if it was available to be sold, or did you find that there was just such great historical interest around the sort of the tragic story of Nixon and his downfall that people would just want, like you maybe suggested, just wanted a sliver of the tapes just to have it as a collectible?
I think that was it was the only reasonable way to sell the Watergate tapes. The Watergate tapes showed two different Nixons. The one in which he's trying to be, in my view, trying to be one of the boys with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And then with Kissinger and other people, he was trying to be a statesman. And I think Nixon had a conflicted personality based on going through his papers and what he did every night, all these ideas that he wrote. And he drank a lot, and you could see the effects on his handwriting. And all of this was created as president. This is all material that should belong to the government. Now it would belong to the government. It ended up, the government took the papers and confiscated the White House tapes, but they were his personal property. So my job was to arrive at a price for them. I would never have sold the papers individually. The value was in the whole unit, the whole picture that it showed. And my own personal opinions did not come into any of this. I looked at all of this dispassionately. I dealt with Nixon's serious financial supporters. It didn't matter whether I liked Nixon or not. He was a president. He was important. He did a lot of important things. He ended the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson couldn't do that, or didn't do it. He opened China. He did a lot of important things. And, I was as excited as everybody else the night of the Saturday Night Massacre. I'm reminded of it because I think it was just the 50th anniversary. I think everybody was irate at Nixon. And wanted to see him impeached, and that he got off lightly by resigning. But that really didn't have anything to do with what the amount of money was that his supporters would have put up to buy the tapes.
Well, I when reading that anecdote about the Watergate tapes and everything, growing up under the Presidential Records Act regime and just assuming all of those materials belong to the government. It shocked me that those objects could have been available for sale at some point. I do have to ask it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, though. But given that this very issue is in the news with the former president, what would you say Trump's letters from Kim Jong-un would probably bring if they were legally available to be sold at an auction?
I don't have any idea. Since I have no idea what they say.
Right.
And they could shed light on how Trump actually acted and how he was perceived by some of these dictators that he clearly seemed to like. I mean, I think that would the object has value, but that information could also be pretty valuable.
Yeah, I'm assuming he's a memento collector. My understanding of Donald Trump is he collects pretty much everything. So it's unfortunate that it's caused him this problem. Unfortunate for us too.
And those written to him as president belong to the government. They don't belong to him.
Right. One of the things you mentioned earlier is you were friends with Malcolm Forbes. You also write that you're friends with another very high profile collector, Harlan Crow. Do you find that some of these affluent individuals have a special fondness for collecting historical objects? I mean, what is it about some of these very wealthy private citizens that are interested in that subject? Is it just out of a love or a patriotism, or is it out of just a fascination with history? Is there any rhyme or reason to why some of these very literate, very involved with civics, politics type of collectors or individuals are interested in collecting?
I think in both those cases, Forbes liked collecting all kinds of things, and he always said that his historical letters were the most important. And he had a lot of things that you could put into a soundbite. He had Paul Revere's expense account, not for the ride, but he never said it wasn't. He never said it was or was not. It was up to the listener to assume it was for his ride. But he had a lot of high spots like that. Harlan, from the time of not having any money, when his father's company was on the ropes 25 years ago or 30 years ago, Harlan was collecting interesting historical letters. And not spending a lot of money, not at all. And Harlan has a great interest in history and politics, in the people involved, and he's been personally involved in quite a lot. Unfortunately, it's really been unfortunate to see him just reduced to Texas billionaire. He's vastly more than that. And he loves entertaining people. We've been guests in all these circumstances that, he's gotten all this criticism with Clarence Thomas. And Harlan is much more of a moderate than Clarence Thomas. And especially everyone's more moderate than his wife. But I was really saddened at the way he was portrayed, because I've been there when a lot of these things happened, and Harlan has lots of guests and lots of people have been on his boat, and he has a fascination with all kinds of political viewpoints.
Well, I think one of the hit pieces against him is that he's a collector of Nazi memorabilia. I don't know the extent of that being a factual statement.
He's collected paintings done by people who were not artists. And Hitler's a well-known artist, and there are a lot of other people that he's collected, Eisenhower, Bush, lots of different people who've done paintings. I think that the amount of Nazi material in his collection, it's not even 1%. I mean, one out of 1,000 or one out. I mean, he's not a collector. He doesn't have anything other than the one Hitler painting. And that came from a soldier who took it out of Hitler's apartment. I know because I was involved, not financially, but in making sure that it was genuine. And collecting something like that also can convey a feeling of the good guys won. The artifacts from these bad guys. It's the reason that soldiers took souvenirs. If you went to Hitler's apartment and you've for 2 years been slogging it out in combat, people took a trophy, and that's exactly how they viewed them. A soldier didn't take that out of Hitler's apartment because he thought Hitler was a great person.
Or a good artist.
Yeah. And he was a poor artist. And I bought Hitler's studio one time for my museum. And it certainly had nothing to do with any kind of honoring Hitler. I was very concerned about showing the atmosphere and how Hitler rose and how he got the support that he did in Germany. That's very important to understand, because you watch someone else appealing to the people who represent brute force, want to eliminate any rights that people have. It's very important that people understand Hitler, because maybe it's happened again. And it's very important to preserve these things. But the soldiers, all the soldiers took souvenirs. And it demystified I remember having a debate at a dinner with the historian Steve Ambrose about why soldiers took souvenirs. And he was arguing because it indicated that there would be a future. They would get to a city and they could mail the souvenirs back. And I argued that there was a big sense of demystifying the enemy, that German Superman isn't such a Superman if you're carrying his dagger on your belt, because he's dead. And I turned to a guy sitting beside me who had a Medal of Honor from World War II, and I said, well, you were there. I said, why did soldiers take souvenirs from the dead Germans? And he said, because they were crazy. He said, if they got caught by the Germans would shoot them if they were carrying something they had taken off of a soldier. And I said, well, you win. You were there. You know what really went on. But I was really disturbed at the portrayal of Harlan Crow, because I know him really well and I know what he's like, and I've been in numerous things. And he has a lot of liberal guests also, and he likes political debates. And Harlan didn't defend himself with any of this, but this is not something at a distance. This is something where I've had lots of discussions with Clarence Thomas, and his story of how he got out of where he was, dirt poor and so on. It's a very compelling story. But I mean, that's fantastic. But why he's gone off as far right wing, that's another issue.
Well, I think about the way collectors sometimes get considered by people who don't collect, especially when you're talking about, collecting controversial things or controversial periods of history. And that, really gets me to the sort of the amorality, I think, of collecting in a way. when people are collecting the coins of the 12 Caesars, they're not necessarily sitting there and thinking about whether Titus or Caligula were good guys. In some respects, I guess the farther in history you get, the horrific nature of tyrants sort of subsides. Perhaps some of these more more recent tyrants are too fresh in the memory that we put all of that, the weight of all of that historical trauma into the idea that someone would collect it. I'm a veteran of the Army, although I didn't go into any theater of combat, but I do imagine that one of the reasons soldiers also collect trophies is to remind themselves of where they were, and to not to have a tangible object, a totem, if you will, for a period in time of great personal trauma and sacrifice and courage or camaraderie or any of those things which are sort of unique to the experience of being a soldier, is all held in those objects. It takes you back. And I think in some respects it's like when we look at coins, that we talk about it as being history you can hold in your hands. There's sort of a psychedelic sort of characteristic to a collectible, because you can hold this and imagine yourself back in its time. You can, read an historical document from, James Madison and imagine, what it was like to be part of the Constitutional Convention or writing the Federalist Papers or being peers with Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington and all these guys. I mean, it's sort of, that's part of the allure of collecting anything, is just imagining yourself in a different place or in a different context. And so sometimes the context is a horrific period of our time, and sometimes the reasons we collect the mementos are not explained by anything but a personal connection. I remember reading in Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, where he was talking about this Lodz ghetto coinage that the people at the camp would have circulated, and he carries that with him when he goes back to look at it. So then the object itself is not really an object. It's more meaningful than the object. It's sort of a totem. And so I can imagine that there has to be, for people who don't collect, some understanding that these objects are, in the eye of a collector, are more than just the object itself. There's a context to it. And I think about, you wrote about the pilot's log for the Enola Gay in your book. That pilot's log is about more than just the dropping of the bomb. I mean, it's really about the humanity changing forever. It's about the experience of those pilots and going into that unknown future. It's about the space age. It's about death and destruction. It's about all sorts of things. It's not just a book at a certain point.
That's absolutely true. And to me, a lot of these objects give off an aura. And I always found that Nazi stuff gave off a real sense of evil. And in my museum, I had, I dealt very much with how things happened, why they happened. How was Britain motivated to fight against Hitler when France and Belgium and Holland, everybody had been conquered? How in the world did the British public fight the way they did and not give up, not make a deal? And those were all positive things. But I had to also create how Nazi Germany was created, with music, with design, with the economics, with the whole overall thing. And I have never had anything Nazi in my office or in my home. The objects signify so much that's negative. And I've treated it that way in business. I told somebody one time, he wanted something of Stalin. And I said, I don't sell anything of Stalin. And I mean, that becomes just my personal decisions as to what I'm comfortable with. I was horrified when there was an auctioneer years ago who used to sell things by killers, murderers that were Son of Sam, Oswald, people like this. I never wanted to touch that stuff. And frankly, I wasn't interested in the people who wanted to buy it. I think a coin with Caligula on it, I don't like the vibes. I'd put it that way. I had a really emotional experience when I bought a filing cabinet that had been Hitler's. And I bought it without really knowing what was in it. And I bought it at an auction in Munich, and it could have been nothing, but I mean, it was full of papers. And I opened something, and all I could think of was the final scene in Indiana Jones where they opened the trunk and these evil spirits came out. I opened up this document that Hitler had folded up. And it turned out to be his earliest anti-Semitic statement. And it was written on the announcement that Germany had signed the surrender at Versailles, ending World War I. And Hitler wrote that this means the Jews are taking over Germany. We have to run them out. I felt such a sense of evil rising from that document. It was a very important document, and it went on display right away. I mean, I was building the whole thing as to what was the roots of anti-Semitism in Germany, beyond the normal Christians who started anti-Semitism. But I don't want to. I mean, I don't sell things like that, I think you want to collect things that give you a good feeling. You can academically collect things like that Hitler because it's very important. And it's very important for people to see how this built. I did an anti-Semitism exhibit in New York that was called Path Breaking. And it basically was how the Holocaust happened. How did it get to the Holocaust? Because it didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't 1 year. It wasn't one thing. And people need to see that accepting anti-Semitism at all these different levels is how it developed into the Holocaust. And I don't personally want this stuff, but from a museum standpoint, it's very important to understand how things happen.
In your book, you talk about something which I don't really think occurs too much more in numismatics, but is the role institutional collections play in driving the market, or maybe not. Maybe that's not the term for it, but at least having an interest in certain pieces of material. Used to be that pretty much every major American university had a numismatic collection, and they seem to have deaccessioned and sold off those over the years. But for papers, I think that's not the case. I think universities are still actively buying papers, building collections. How much do institutional buyers impact or influence the market, and what types of material are they typically looking for?
Well, they're looking for archives. They're looking for the great preference is for complete archives of someone or a collection about a period of time, because it's all about research value. How many PhDs can you get out of this? I'm sorry to put it in such basic terms, but when I used to do a lot of appraisals, that's what it was based on. What are the uses that this library can put the collection to? I don't think libraries are much of a factor anymore. They're not buying single pieces. Prices have risen too high. I mean, they certainly would buy, something that really related to where they already had a collection, and it's a journal or a diary that would have a lot of new information, but it's not significant. At one time, most of my business was with research libraries. In part, I located lots of archives and I sold them to appropriate universities. And I think that business has gone down because I aggressively went out and found archives, and they're not out there anymore. And new people aren't creating archives. Everything is saved on a computer. So that's changed that dramatically.
So now I guess the market has become so sophisticated that the individual documents are more valuable than what an institution would be willing to pay for them. And then if you're researching things, you can digitize everything. I mean, the fact that a lot of this material could be digitized. Do you see a future where things that are held in collections, university collections, may be deaccessioned because they already have scans of it? Or do you think most academic institutions perceive a value in preserving that for time?
I think that they perceive a value in the originals. You can't have exhibits with digital records. But I do see places, as universities claim to not have money, because they have so many administrators. But I see places getting into trouble, and I could see them deaccessioning. There would be real legal problems. I mean, this has come up from donors, and also for fundraising, I would think, if they're deaccessioning material. There's been an outcry quite a few times when places, it's been more with paintings by Norman Rockwell. The museum was going to close its doors or sell one of the Rockwell paintings. And everybody screaming that you can't sell. They didn't seem to be contributing money to keep the museum open. But one of the big Norman Rockwell collectors stepped in to fund everything because he wanted to keep the Rockwell Museum open. And this is not the Norman Rockwell Museum, but it's a museum in that area that was having a lot of trouble.
So you were one of the first dealers in your market to develop a laboratory for detecting forgeries. How big of a problem were forgeries at the time you created your lab, and has that problem gotten worse? And how do you determine that a document is not a forgery?
Well, what I was always struck by dealers saying to me, they just knew something was a forgery. They just knew that it was genuine. And there were historical forgeries, meaning they were done in the 20s and 30s of Washington, Lincoln, and so on. And they did look different, a little bit different. And I wanted to know what it was everybody, including me, was seeing. I mean, what is it, that why, if you've seen a lot of genuine ones, there's something funny about this. But I thought that collectors should know that you can actually prove it, that there's forensically something different about this document. And no one had done this, which surprised me. And I thought that if you had a case with where forgery was a question, you'd have to really make a case to a jury so that the jury understood it. You couldn't just go and say, I'm Ken Rendell, I've looked at hundreds of documents, I know this is a fake. Because the other side will come up with somebody who says it's real. And so I became fascinated with taking everything apart, taking a letter apart in terms of what kind of ink was used, what wrote it. I mean, was it a quill pen? What the writing instrument? How could you date paper? I mean, the biggest thing was that there were new inventions in paper, and they're dead obvious. So if you have something in 1820, it's not on paper that was made in 1920. It's physically really different. And then I wrote the book, which is the standard reference book on forging history. And I took everything apart and I explained it as if I was doing it to a jury. So you could see the magnified version of this writing and how it touched up and how it didn't have any characteristics of normal writing. I was amazed nobody had done this. I bought a couple of years ago the defense exhibits in the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case. And everything revolved around the ransom letter. And did Bruno Hauptmann write the letter? And I haven't tried to reach a determination. I will at some point, because there were lots of books written saying he never did it and that he was railroaded. And the quality of a lot of the people involved in these cases is not, these are all the kinds of people who authenticated the Hitler diaries, authenticated Jack the Ripper. They were wrong. So you can reach your own conclusions as to how analytical they really were. But that's why I started this, and it's not that big a lab. You don't need that much. It's got a 200 power microscope, which can go down to 20 power, so you can really look at things. And there's ultraviolet and different light sources, and then lots of templates for looking at typewriter. Because you can date typewriters very quickly. I don't know. I was really curious, and I find it really interesting. I find it interesting the mistakes that people make in being a forger. You mentioned Elvis Presley earlier. The forger. He did very good forgeries with Elvis. They consistently showed his writing style, but Elvis's writing style changed. He didn't write many letters at all. He said in one of them that he hated writing, and his writing style kept changing all the time. Capital letters were different. Everything was different. And the forgeries in the Elvis Presley case were all based on one letter. And it was very good if Elvis had written with consistency, but he didn't. And also, they had too much information about the provenance of the manuscripts. From the time Elvis wrote these, they named everybody who had been involved and how they came to be today, which was a hell of a mistake. I think a lot of people assumed, well, with all this history, there's no question they're genuine. I mean, this all makes sense. Well, it would have made sense if it was true. It came down to things like on these manuscripts, it said, Liz, type this up, Elvis. Well, the problem was I could find Liz. Graceland put me in touch with her. And she was Elvis's secretary at this time when he was in Germany. And I called her and she said, Elvis never called me Liz. Well, that's the starter. And then she said, I never saw any manuscripts like this. Well, I mean, you have the handwriting, but the story really starts to fall apart. And Graceland put me in touch with the Elvis Mafia, who were still alive and still around, and they were happy to tell me they never saw any manuscripts like this. So I don't do this kind of thing anymore because of the time involved, and there's a real cutoff, because if it's not handwritten now, I mean, how do you know what was produced by a computer? It's a different world, but the money is in older things anyhow. So it's possible I'd get involved in something.
Well, this may seem like a ridiculous question, but as older documents, as far as they go, or especially documents that were created before the printing press, never find that any of these were, put together by illiterate forgers, like people who didn't know exactly what they were writing about or the language they were writing in?
I guess I haven't. I mean, I'm sure I must have, come across stuff that was so bad it just was a glance, and that was the end of it. But it's not anything that I remember.
So I want to talk to you real quick about the passing of your son. You mentioned your relationship with him, and you sort of speak about him and in very positive and upbeat ways, and you feel, at least in the book, you sort of come across as if you and your son did everything that you were meant to do together, and you look at that I think very differently as a bookend to how you discuss the passing of your father. Clearly, you're probably in a different point in your life when that tragedy struck you. But can you talk a little bit about him and your relationship with him, and why you feel that you two did everything together you were meant to do?
Well, I wouldn't say meant to do. We did everything that we wanted to do, and I never had that attitude because I expected somebody else to die. It was all based on a thought that I had a long time ago, that if I found out I had 3 months to live or 6 months to live, I would not want to try to catch up on all the things I wish I had said to people, all the things I wish I had done, and that I would really keep up to date with things and with people. So that's the way I viewed it. The reason that I wrote what I did, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, you must wish you had, more time to have done something." Well, no, not. I'm dealing with that specific issue. I didn't put things off. I did things. We climbed mountains. We did things, and he knew how I felt. I mean, it was up to date. It wasn't. I had friends who had teenage boys who died in car accidents. Well, they always wish they had done this. They wish they had said it. And I lived in a way where I didn't have those regrets. It took a great deal to overcome what happened, and it doesn't go away. But I wanted to write how I dealt with it and how my wife and I dealt with it. Because the first thing I said to her when I was at Bill Gates's house when this happened, and she called me, and the first thing I said to her was, "We will survive," because most marriages don't. It's not anybody's fault, but people are so upset individually, they fight. And, when one partner's having problems, it's easy to set off a fight over things that aren't that consequential. When you have a loss like this, it's very easy to be so preoccupied with how you feel that you're not as responsive to your partner. And we were determined not to have that happen. So I wanted to tell people, there is you can survive. It's terrible, people saying, bring closure. Bullshit. I mean, there is no closure. It never closes. And if you think it does, then you're going to go around wondering why it doesn't. It lasts. It doesn't go away. But life can come back, and you see other things in life, but that hole is there. And you have to deal with if you feel angry. I spoke to someone in the coin world who recently lost his son. And this is very recently. And I thought he was pretty angry at his son because of risky behavior. And I would think that he would be, but I think he needs to recognize it and see the big context of it, because there are all these emotions, and you need help. I mean, you can't sort through this yourself. You need an advisor, psychiatrist, psychologist, but somebody who knows the normal reactions in a situation. So, I mean, I thought I can't write something complete if I don't deal with this. And I'm always willing to talk to people if it's happened to them. And I'm always willing to try to help them understand. It'll take time, but you've got to recognize what a tragedy it is. The bullshit letters I got from people, religion was the answer, and everything put in a religious context. I can't imagine any of them would have felt what they told me I should be feeling. And I was really angry at those letters. I put the two best letters in the book, and it was really odd, the two people who wrote them. They were good letters. It was a tragedy, and you recognize it as such. It's terrible what happened, but you can't make excuses for it. You can't. There is no rationalization. These are tragedies in life that happen. Mainly because teenage boys are very different from girls. Girls develop a sense of risk-taking, fear, and boys don't. And that's why so many boys die in accidents. They're risk takers. My son was a risk taker. He would have grown out of it. I don't know if grown out of it's the right word. He would have developed a different attitude 7-8 years later. Would be different.
Well, you mentioned an anecdote you mentioned is when you're climbing the mountain, that you're at the top of the mountain, and that's when it's the most dangerous because you drop your guard. I mean,
yeah,
very, very insightful.
Well, and also, I mean, the reality is that if people really continue climbing on a serious level, everybody that I've known gets killed. It's a dangerous sport, and if you keep climbing more difficult things, you'll find the limit. But so often you don't know it because you're not alive anymore. So I felt with this book that I wanted it to really be complete, and that's an enormous factor in my life. It's a huge hole, and the pain of it never goes away. but I wanted my book to really. I said it in the book. I'm doing a talk in New York next week that I wrote yesterday. I really don't like situations where people, they see the success, they think, oh, they never could do that, that person's on a pedestal, and they don't see how long somebody worked on something and that they could do it. And I want to encourage people to try things. I put everything I did about the business side of things because I want to encourage people to deal in historical artifacts, deal in these different areas. If you don't have any money, but you're really interested in coins, well, look into tokens, look into what service you could provide. I mean, I was just looking at my coin collection, which is quite a good collection. And I was reminiscing about things I had sold. They're in my envelopes, or they've been sold with me on the provenance. And I've bought some of them back just for the memories. And I was providing a real service with colonials. I would go to a coin show. I would look at everything. Colonial collectors go to a coin show. It's unusual if you find stuff. But I was doing all that footwork, putting it into lists, and making it easy for people to collect. What service can you do? And seeing opportunities. Anyhow, I really do want to encourage people. I've had a great life. I hope I've got another 10, 15 years of it. And being in touch with the people of history in every context, whatever it is, has been tremendous. I'm interested in people of the past, people today. And I feel really good about things, and I want to encourage. I think hopelessness is such a problem these days. Look at the world. I mean, the world is horrible. I said in an interview on Sunday, I don't want to just sound like an old guy saying everything's gone to hell, but it really has, and that's speaking from an historian standpoint. Things really have gone to hell, and trying to make sense or understanding. There isn't any sense to most of what's going on in the United States. But you can understand it, the overreactions and the fears that people at both ends of the spectrum have, and so on. But the artifacts are a wonderful way of life, and you can escape into them. You can escape into that period. For me, I like escaping into the history of the American West. And when the bad guys wore black hats and the good guys wore white hats, nobody wore gray. And of course, it's all oversimplified, but that's okay. It's a relief to get away from some of this. So I really do. I wanted to encourage people that to try. I did not know I couldn't do things, and so I did them. And not everything worked, and it's in the book. Things that I thought might be good businesses, things I wanted to try, didn't work. I mean, but I got out of them really fast. I didn't waste time when I saw that it wouldn't work. So I hope that people would be encouraged with the book. You can't have much worse childhood than I had, and you can come out of it. Get off your ass.
Well, I could say that I certainly related to it. I think it's essential reading for collectors. I think it's essential reading for anybody who's trying to get into the business of dealing in collectibles. I don't think you need to be into documents or historical manuscripts to find a lot of value here. And the human story that you tell and the honesty in which you open up about your own life, I found to be quite, moving. And the idea of seeing reflections of your life, which I have in my own experience, and to see how you dealt with them, was very, it's definitely struck a chord with me. This was probably one of the most influential books I think I've read about the way I look at collectibles in some time. So I really appreciate you writing it and taking the time to do it. And I'm sure you're going to get a lot of positive feedback for it. I mean, it's a quite powerful book.
I have, and coins have been one of the common denominators of letters people have sent me, that people I know, because they're the only ones who've had the book. Amazon sold out in pre-orders, and it's been a problem getting enough new books every day to them. But the letters I've had, I mean, one guy who's a very serious rare book collector, and he is president of a huge banking system, told me about how he got started with coins. It seems like everybody started with coins when they were a kid. And I've gotten surprisingly good letters from people opening up. And I think that's great that they're seeing themselves historically. I think there's a real tendency to not really reflect on your life very much, or people reflect on the facts. And I would never, ever have written the usual kind of book, how great I am, look at all the things that I've sold. Well, if that's your view of yourself, that's too bad. I've had some comments on my chapter, what I'm proud of. And people just were really surprised that none of it was business. But none of it is. So much of this was done spontaneously. Once I got rolling with it, I was pretty surprised at some of this. I was really glad. I've enjoyed it. And the strange thing is that I wrote this because of the kids in the educational program where I grew up who were doing well. And I started telling them about my life. And I hadn't really told anybody about it. And that got me going. And that was the spark, and oddly, what my foundation is called, the Spark Foundation. But in the end, no matter what the book does, it did me a huge amount of good. It gave me a view of my life that I didn't have. I was going so fast all the time, taking on new things, that stopping and spending about a year looking at it was tremendous for me personally. My wife told me, don't make this analogy publicly because it sounds ridiculous. But John Eisenhower, the only child of Dwight Eisenhower, told me that when his father was president and he would get criticized or have trouble with Congress, he'd sit in the Oval Office and pound his fist on the desk and say, God damn it, I won the war. That's enough. And when I finished this, I thought 60 years and all these things, that's enough. There are other things I want to do, but I felt pretty satisfied. I don't want another big appraisal case or court case. I would take it on if I thought somebody was getting screwed, somebody was innocent and there was bad testimony. But I've done all those things. There are other things I want to do. So I'm working on the sequel. I'll have to spend 10 years on it to create things that could be in a sequel. But I greatly appreciate your comments.
Well, I appreciate, like I said, I appreciate the book, and I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. about it.
Good conversation.
I appreciate it. Well, you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. It was fun talking.
If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends. Remember, you can download every episode of the CoinWeek Podcast for free on the iTunes Store. Stream it online on our YouTube channel or on coinweek.com. For CoinWeek, I'm editor Charles Morgan. Until next time, happy collecting.